Excuse me, now it's my privilege to introduce Nelson Dong, who's a member of NBR's Board of Advisors. He was of counsel in the Seattle office of Dorsey and Whitney, where he represented tech companies and research institutions in domestic and international tech and IP transactions. He's got special expertise in U.S. export controls, national security, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I'm going to end it right here. And Nelson will run the next panel. Thank you all.
I would ask the panel members to come on up. We're fighting a very fast clock today, so we want to move briskly through this. While our panel members are coming, I want to give you a brief overview of U.S. export control terminology. When practitioners in the field of export controls in the United States talk about export controls, they usually talk about three flavors of export controls. There are economic sanctions administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, at the Treasury Department. There are munitions controls administered by the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls at the State Department that are known by the acronym ITAR, or International Traffic in Arms Regulations. And finally, there are the Export Administration Regulations administered by the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. With a name like Export Administration Regulations, the common way of saying that is EAR. Most of our comments today on this panel are going to focus on the EAR because that's where dual-use technology is controlled. The guts of the EAR are a huge catalog of technologies listed in 10 categories across the Commerce Control List, or the CCL. And now, more than ever, in addition to those listed technologies, the Commerce Department has added in recent years more controls that are based on the end use of technology or the end user of technology. Finally, my final comment on this is that the companies that have to obey these rules are generally forced to think about them very seriously because the government has both civil and criminal tools to enforce these rules. And we expect during the Trump administration that there will be far more vigorous enforcement of these efforts in regard to some of the security threats that we're seeing. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to quickly introduce Katherine Moy from Microsoft, who is, in addition to being the corporate counsel for international trade and export controls at Microsoft, is also a veteran of the U.S. Justice Department. Next to her is John VerWey, who is at Pacific Northwest National Laboratories and is an expert on export controls. And finally, we have Dale Swartz from McKinsey and Company, who is one of the leaders in his firm's advisory group dealing with national security issues and supply chain security. So I'm going to ask each of them to begin with their opening comments, and then we'll have some moderated questions and reserve some time for your questions.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. I'm just going to give a few observations about emerging technology and recent trends in export controls. So in recent years, we've seen a broadening of the concept of national security to include more of a focus on economic competition, particularly in the realm of emerging technologies. So to build a little bit on what Nelson was just saying, historically, export controls have been designed to ensure that U.S.-made technology is not used to advance the military, intelligence, or surveillance activities of U.S. adversaries. And economic sanctions serve the complementary goal of blocking support for parties that are engaged in activities contrary to U.S. foreign policy, such as unlawful military actions, attacks on U.S. interests, human rights abuses, and the like. In recent years, both of these goals have coincided with efforts to safeguard U.S. competitiveness, which is a shift. So export controls and sanctions should not be solely or explicitly focused on advancing U.S. commercial interests. That's not what they're for. They are explicitly for security purposes and foreign policy purposes. But there is a fear among U.S. policymakers that allowing other countries to lead in the development of cutting-edge technologies, emerging technologies, could afford adversaries an irreversible strategic advantage. So there's a very clear interlink between economic competitiveness and security competitiveness, or strategic security advantage. This change in focus has meant that regulators are seeking to expand existing export control and sanctions, and also develop new and novel ways of achieving national security goals for the U.S. that are not necessarily tied to traditional export control and sanctions mechanisms. A key tipping point for this that demonstrated the shift, as you all are probably very well aware, were the brand new export controls on semiconductors that the Commerce Department started in 2022 and followed up on in 2023. So those were clearly designed to hamper China's development of advanced computing and the technologies that rely on those chips, partially to avoid and prevent China from advancing its military goals, which is sort of in the traditional export control bucket, but also to hamper China's technological development overall and safeguard U.S. technology leadership. And that has coincided with an expansion and a reimagining of these list-based controls that Nelson mentioned. And it's particularly salient in the realm of emerging technology, not just semiconductors and advanced computing, but things like quantum, AI, biotechnology. Those technologies are challenging this traditional list-based framework. It's harder to, categorize technologies for controls based on their characteristics or based on their end uses. And that's, I think, I attribute two reasons for why emerging technologies are really kind of pushing on the boundaries of traditional export controls and sanctions. One is that these technologies are evolving too quickly. It's very hard to predict what the next AI system, the frontier AI system, will look like 5 years from now, if only because we did not know that 5 years ago it would look the way that it does today. And the second is that the positive use cases of these technologies are extremely compelling. And the cost of restricting exports on U.S. technologies of these, U.S. exports of these technologies may outweigh the benefits in some people's minds. So an example I like to think of is, think about infrared sensors for night vision goggles. Those sensors probably today look about the same. They're about as capable as they were 10 years ago. If they're more capable, they're generally better at doing exactly the thing that we expected them to do, which is to help a pair of goggles help someone see better in the dark. That is not the case for something like AI. What was true 5 years ago, the use cases could not have been envisioned the way that we see them today, and we can only imagine the kind of proliferation and expansion and innovation that will come in 5 years. So it's kind of apples and oranges comparing a technology that's traditionally been subject to things like the ITAR or the EAR and what we might see in the future for emerging technology. And so as a result, regulators are turning to different ways of getting their arms around these emerging technologies, short of putting them on lists for controls. One is reporting requirements. The U.S. government wants to know what are U.S. firms up to. There are proposed rules from 2024. I'll put a pin in that because the future of these rules is a little bit uncertain in the new administration, but a couple of different versions of asking U.S. companies, what AI models are you developing? Can you tell us the computing clusters that you have at a particular threshold? Or we will need you, if you are offering infrastructure as a service, to inform the U.S. government about customers training AI models above a certain technological threshold. Another even more kind of far afield example of this is outbound investment regulations that were issued and finalized last fall as well. Those aren't even about exports at all, as traditionally defined. They're all about the ways in which U.S. firms are allocating capital in a way the U.S. government feels would advance technological development and thereby help China compete. And all of that, I think, is part of the same toolbox to get at this economic competitiveness issue, particularly in emerging technologies. And that's kind of a new way of imagining the role of export control and sanctions. And kind of getting at the same underlying concern of maintaining U.S. technological advantage. So there's more to come, I'm sure, on that. With that, I'll wrap up.
Great. So I'm going to briefly discuss a paper that we recently published through NBR that is focused on sort of China's response to everything Katherine just described. There's, of course, been a lot of attention paid in the last 8 years to U.S. changes to its technology protection regimes between export controls, supply chain security, CFIUS, et cetera. There's been a lot less attention paid to what China is doing in response, especially what it is doing on the regulatory and legal side to prepare itself to retaliate to these sorts of controls. So with some colleagues at P&L, I did a report this past year that looked at that issue in particular. And we found very quickly, actually, the last comprehensive study was done by RAND Corporation in 2005. So this is an area that is ripe for more research. We are only able to do so much, of course. But to summarize briefly what we found, since 2018, which is when the Export Control Reform, ECRA, Export Control Reform Act was passed, which updated our regime for emerging technology controls and also CFIUS, China has kind of undertaken a similar approach. They are really modernizing things and adding new tools to their toolbox in terms of technology protection. So they've introduced stuff like an unreliable entity list, similar to our entity list approach, where they can name and shame companies or subsidiaries of companies that they're not happy to be doing business with. They've also updated what they call their foreign trade law, which is their governing law that handles their export control regime, similar to the ERCCL that Nelson was describing. They've instituted a totally new licensing process. It turns out China does export control licensing the exact opposite way we do in the United States. It starts at the city and provincial level, and you work up from there to the national level. They've modernized that full stack, and it's becoming a lot more efficient and robust in terms of both monitoring and enforcement, in addition to the licensing. In addition to that new licensing process, they're also, of course, instituting new licenses and new license requirements. So since 2023, there have been at least 10 different critical minerals and materials and their derivatives that have been controlled. The ones that get a lot of headlines right now are gallium, germanium, high purity graphite, especially artificial graphite, and then some more obscure items like tungsten derivatives. But the punchline here that is important to understand is that we make almost none of this in the United States, especially in processed forms and fits and functions that are important for national security applications. And China knows this. They've done the research to understand where they have sort of choke point controls, and they are instituting these license requirements on Chinese firms very effectively. There's been little leakage that we could find in our research. And for those who are interested in this, I would encourage you to pursue that line in particular because much like things with our export controls on AI chips, the trade diversion story is extremely interesting and worth more study. Finally, the big thing to pay attention to is that this export control modernization that's happening in China right now is one part of a much larger toolkit that is being modernized. And while this paper was focused purely on sort of that modernization effort, we're seeing a lot more use of things like the anti-sanctions law, antitrust laws in China to target firms that are doing business like Micron, NVIDIA, Intel, and then also procurement requirements, which are forcing American firms that are eager to sell into the Chinese market to contend with the fact that they're barred from approaching especially Chinese government affiliates and systems and selling into those systems based on those new procurement requirements. So there's a much broader suite of activity that's happening here. Our focus in this paper was just on export controls. Thanks.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And one, thanks, Nelson, for moderating. Two, thank you, NBR, for putting on this amazing and very important conference, and look forward to the conversation here. So as Nelson mentioned, most of the work that I do is actually on the industry side. So I spend a lot of time on particularly dual use oriented sort of high technology and sort of related, kind of supply chain firms, both in the US and globally. And what I thought I'd actually do is to build a little bit on what my panelists have already talked about and maybe give you just a couple of the key questions and considerations that we actually think about from an industry perspective primarily. And I would kind of put, lots of, fuel for our fire here, maybe a couple elements that we think about and that we hear a lot from, many of the industry folks that we work with. A category on sort of the risks, which I think actually folks know relatively well. There's a piece of this which is actually opportunity too, and then maybe I'll just do a couple of open questions as well. From a macro perspective, and this actually I don't think gets talked about enough. We did a little bit of homework last year, and it's actually surprising how few people have done this homework to say, if you look at Taiwan and you look at the Taiwan microelectronics industry, what is the effect if you lost access to that in the U.S. from a GDP perspective? We think it's 15 to 20%. Just immediately, right? Huge, significant, confluence between sort of the geoeconomic side of this and obviously from a policy perspective. And you think about, Katherine, many of the things that you outlined in terms of, what are we solving for from an export control perspective? It's frankly to shift some of that balance, right? This is a huge, huge concern in industry, and it's actually kind of particularly relevant. We talked sort of technology areas. We actually think it's actually helpful to even split that a little bit farther because the types of firms and the types of what you're actually building and producing or not is actually pretty diagnostic here. The questions, concerns, and discussions for design and R&D actually end up being quite different than when you're talking manufacturing. And often a lot of the pieces on the manufacturing sort of true hardware side of this end up being a little bit of a different sort of piece of the equation, right? When you're talking design side, there's a lot of, questions around sort of sources of distinctiveness, sort of IP generation, sort of tech transfer, and how do you think about sort of protection of advantage from that perspective? On the manufacturing side, this is where, you are thinking about, if you're going to shift from a footprint perspective and otherwise for sort of a large global firm, or thinking about it from sort of the perspective of any of the capitals here, the capital expenditure profile, the cost curve, and just the, John, many of the things that you kind of talked about from a supply chain perspective end up getting pretty diagnostic pretty quickly. And so this whole what piece of the industry, what piece of the technology are we talking about, what actually are you solving for from an export control perspective actually ends up being really, really important and gets you, I think, sort of a different outcome. So there's maybe a couple of things that we think about on sort of the, sort of the risk side, which we can unpack. The opportunity here is actually pretty big if you're thinking about many folks from a industry perspective. I mean, semiconductors alone, right? Sort of the total estimated revenue of that industry by 2030 is $1 trillion. Export controls fundamentally shift the game board in many parts of this industry, right? And so a lot of the question that we end up talking about is, particularly when you have a number of different policy regimes that are basically in effect sort of forcing you to choose a side, forcing you to choose the side actually has a pretty significant revenue impact and actually can be an upside because, if you start to think about this and, frankly, a little bit from a protectionist perspective, you have actually a little bit of a moat in order to move up a knowledge technology process curve or otherwise that, frankly, in a global market, you would be less competitive on. It's actually a really interesting question that sort of folks are grappling with sort of across the board. And it does lead, as we've kind of done work and sort of mapped who ends up being successful in these regimes and who isn't from an industry perspective, actually being kind of, it sounds obvious, but it's actually kind of funny how it isn't. Those who are proactive in making moves versus those who are kind of waiting to see kind of what the next BIS list sort of means for them actually means a material difference in change in market share, actually means a pretty material difference in your sort of total return to shareholders, right? And so starting to think that the archetypes of, as a board member, as a CEO, sort of a member of a leadership team, somebody who's running sort of critical supply chains, what are the things that you can do with your team, with your government counterparts, or otherwise actually get ahead of the curve, actually ends up having sort of a pretty material advantage here. Last piece, and I'll shut up, Nelson. Couple open questions. And I actually thought Ambassador Lippert did an amazing job of laying out some of the, kind of the key pieces on here. Maybe I'll just augment a couple quickly. The talent piece on this is huge in the implications on the kind of the export control side. He mentioned STEM. I totally agree with that. The other piece of this, when you think about the manufacturing side and sort of building critical supply chains, is actually skilled trades in many cases. This is equal parts of manufacturing challenge, actually, is having sort of brilliant engineers. You need both, right? And sometimes we actually don't get the balance right. That's piece one. Piece two is the partnerships piece on the government and on the industry side. As folks have alluded to, these are very, very technical sets of requirements. Things that, affect industry quite a bit sort of across the board. One, having a real cadre of folks on the public sector side who know this, can shape it, can be agile is incredibly important, but also making sure that there's an ongoing, pretty agile dialogue between the public and private sector to make sure these rules are tuned in ends up being pretty important. And the last just piece I would say is there's huge industrial policy implications here. And one of the things that we struggle, I think sort of working through with clients quite a bit is like, is the natural evolution of this in the West just as much as in, parts of East Asia that you kind of have to have national champions as you're thinking about, helping folks kind of navigate sort of export control regimes. So, all right, I'll shut up. Let's get into it.
Okay. So my opening question to the three of you is to ask you to look back over the last decade or so, over the Obama years, the Biden years, the Trump years. What were the high points and the low points of export controls? And how did either China or the American private sector respond to those changes?
I'll start. I mean, I think, not to dodge the question, but we're still kind of seeing what the ramifications of the new approach to export controls are. I mean, in the commentary surrounding the release of the Biden administration's AI diffusion rule at the end of January, middle of January, there were a lot of folks discussing the fact that the implications on diversion and the success of the 2022 semiconductor export controls are kind of yet to be seen. Like we're only 2.5 years out from those. So I think it's a little early to say. I can say I think there are examples of success, maybe not success stories. It might even be too early for those, but I think best practices that are good examples that I would point to in what I would call the new world of export controls, which are complicated by the multilateral export control regimes kind of failing, which is a whole separate conversation. But I think I would point to, for example, the quantum export controls that were released in September. That's an example where the U.S. government consulted industry. I think there was a lot of thought put into how to reconcile a key challenge when you're talking about controlling quantum technology, which, like Dale mentioned, is talent. That rule really takes into account the ways in which U.S. firms in particular need to leverage international talent to be able to do real-time collaboration across a number of different labs and locations to truly maintain, the edge in quantum technology. And it was paired with, not a traditional multilateral structure for export controls, but significant negotiations with partner countries to try to keep the right folks in lockstep. And so I think those are some, that was only in September. Time will tell whether it has significant industry ramifications, but I think there are positive signs there.
Maybe I'll start with something that didn't go great and something that is more positive. So going back to that law I mentioned in 2018, ECRA, there was a requirement in there that BIS develop a process to identify and control emerging and foundational technologies. We're 7 years from that law being passed, and they've done very little to implement it. And part of that is because they're not optimized as an agency to be empowered to identify emerging technologies. They are export control subject matter experts. But that is a very valuable endeavor and something that should be part of a national security technology strategy. And BIS, for a variety of reasons, was not able to really pursue that through to the end. And it's something that is sort of lingering out there still because the requirement hasn't gone away. It's just they've not been able to staff it and resource it to see it through to the end. But that's one area that's been a challenge for sure. On the flip side, thinking if that's one of those big protect actions, on the promote side, obviously the CHIPS Act that was already talked about is great. To have TSMC building in Chandler, Arizona, Samsung in Taylor, Texas. We have every leading edge chip manufacturer in the world building in the United States right now. No other country can claim that. And I think we've spent 36 of the $39 billion in incentives, and we did that in a 2-year period, which by government standards is extremely fast. So I think those are some success stories. And Dale, maybe I'll pitch it to you because I know you're deeper on that.
Yeah, I mean, I defer to the folks representing our esteemed governments in the room about sort of success from a policy perspective, right? Because I'm, certainly not equipped to talk about that. But if you just think about a policy action having a material shift in outcome, maybe there's I think a positive one I'd highlight, and then one where, it's probably a little bit open. To build on the semiconductor example, I think it is generally regarded that the trilateral partnership between the Dutch, the Japanese, and the Americans on restrictions to China of advanced lithography equipment and sort of related pieces was incredibly successful in preventing basically that process transfer from making it where they didn't want it to go. I think importantly, that was it required not just one actor to do that. It was significant consultation both between sort of the government side and the industry side, and sort of very close work at, I think, the most senior levels across sort of those three capitals to make that happen. And I think you can see sort of that shift. And, maybe, John, we can even have a dialogue on this. I kind of defer to you a little bit, but I think there's a view of, again, depends on what you're solving for. If you're solving for making a political point, perhaps, some of the restrictions that have come out of China on the gallium and germanium perspective ultimately may have been less successful given some of the lead times associated with that. There is an opportunity for folks in the U.S. and otherwise to basically seek alternative sources of supply, but there's obviously a process in order to get there, right? Yeah.
So let me shift the focus a little bit. In recent days, all of us have been following the news and reading about all of these layoffs of federal employees and downsizing of agencies. Under the radar, the export control world has been rocked by several key personnel at BIS being terminated, including Matt Borman, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Export Administration. A couple of us on this panel, maybe three of us, know Matt. Can you talk a little bit about your views on how, even as the government is trying to increase the effectiveness of these export controls, they are hemorrhaging the personnel with the deepest institutional knowledge?
I'll talk briefly about that. Yeah, so I worked at BIS about 10 years ago. Matt Borman was my Deputy Assistant Secretary at the time. It was my first job in government. And I think the thing that I'm struck by most is that export controls are so arcane that you sort of need the state capacity and institutional knowledge to learn up in the field writ large. So Matt's an example of that capacity. He was there, I think, from the early 90s until very recently. And those sorts of obscure government regulatory processes function best when there is sort of a relationship between extremely senior folks who've seen it all and done it all and know the background, and those more junior staff that are coming in and getting trained up. So I think it's very important to maintain some of that stability.
As a footnote, Matt was awarded one of the top civil service awards for long-term contributions to American government by the Trump administration in 2017. Yet his notice was for lack of performance.
Yeah, I would just add that I think it's interesting. In a vacuum, you would think that dismissing a lot of people across the board would kind of be consistent with a general deregulatory stance. And I think that that is probably true for this new administration across other agencies. But I think everybody here understands that there is not a policy desire on the part of the new administration to dramatically dial back technology controls or suddenly kind of allow, emerging technology to proliferate in a place like China, for example. So those two things do not seem consistent. I think from an industry perspective, sort of like John was mentioning, the export control process involves quite a bit of back and forth with industry. There's constantly new guidance, frequently asked questions, because these regulations are arcane, and there are fewer people to talk to now, and that just means that feedback happens a lot more slowly and there's less advance notice. So the onus kind of falls on industry to make sure that we are as proactive as we can be with our government counterparts, with everybody else, benchmarking with our colleagues across the industry, to kind of figure out, keep our ear to the ground and kind of know where the wind is blowing, not to mix many metaphors.
Okay. My next question really has to do with the comments that John made about, and Dale made about plurilateral and multilateral controls. The Trump philosophy seems to disdain working with allies and relying on cooperative networks like NATO or the Wassenaar arrangement for export controls, and to have America sort of go on its own. But you mentioned the recent examples of lithography, the high scale lithography that resulted in the agreement with Japan and the Netherlands. Talk to us a little bit more about that and where you see the future of those kinds of cooperative arrangements going.
Sure, maybe I'll start with a brief story. So probably about 8 or 10 years ago, the US government discovered that a Chinese firm named Fujian Jinhua had stolen a lot of intellectual property from Micron through a subsidiary in Taiwan. And the response by the US government was to essentially tell every US equipment supplier, including lithography suppliers and etch and deposition, that they couldn't sell to Fujian Jinhua, which of course resulted in billions of dollars of lost sales, and these US firms were very sad about it. But that action was done somewhat unilaterally, and the result of that was that the Japanese suppliers of that exact same equipment were able to just go straight to Fujian Jinhua and offer their comparable equipment without much competition for sales in that regard. The government learned from that lesson, and that's sort of why there is more motivation for plurilateral agreements that reduce trade diversion in the event these controls are instituted. And it's particularly important in the chip industry on the equipment side, more so than anywhere else, because there are a handful of firms worldwide that can do any one of these very niche technology processes, but you have to be able to coordinate because they're basically offering comparable goods. With the exception of ASML in the Netherlands, there is at least some competition in each of these submarkets. So I'll stop there.
Only other thing, I think that's exactly right. The only other thing I might build on is the interconnected global nature of these supply chains just means that, frankly, if you were going to have a robust, enduring export control regime where the kind of innovation frontier sort of keeps pushing, like that just by definition, the way this is set up is going to require sort of that level of competition or competition and coordination, right? If you think about things that are, key critical choke points. I mean, there's lithography, you're thinking sort of key substrates, precursor chemicals and sort of things like that just on the semiconductor side, right? That is a, significant conversation very quickly with not just, 4 or 5 different players, but actually pretty rapidly becomes sort of dozens as well, right? And so, inputting this into some of the other, I think, multi-governmental discussions that are happening just becomes that much more important.
Dale, since you're based down in the Valley, could you talk a little bit more, not only about the hardware side, but about the software side and electronic design automation, EDA software, and the major players like Cadence and others?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do it briefly. And then I'm sure Catherine's ears perked up a little bit when she heard software. So if you want to pile on the AI side or whatever, that's, that's certainly a piece too, right? But again, I always find in audiences like this, a lot of people know a lot about semiconductors, and then other people are like, that's something pretty important that I should pay attention to, just given how complex a topic it is. Going back to that piece, and I think you teed it up well, I mean, there are, certain integrated firms sort of across, design, engineering, et cetera, all the way through to manufacturing, but it's actually just not a ton, right? In just the way that the industry has evolved, there is very much a culture of, as Apple says, designed in California, sort of, made in China, or sort of its equivalent, right? And, Nelson, you alluded to some of the critical firms that not just do, chip design themselves, but actually provide some of the critical design tools and software and otherwise that are really important to have this done. It's a critical element here. It's actually one where the industry hasn't evolved that much, frankly, in sort of a decade or more. It's a couple of, relatively unknown outside of the industry, but incredibly important players, right? And so as you are thinking about, multiple countries trying to basically sort of move the sort of the advanced logic curve forward, having that capability access sort of across the board, it ends up becoming that much more important, right? And so, I think a lot of the export control discussion there, and, others on the panel can sort of comment on it, ends up actually centering very quickly on some of those process and design technologies just as much as everything else. You're an expert in this too, Nelson. You should pile on too.
Well, I think, the government has become much more sophisticated in regulating all of these individual chains. And that goes back to my comment earlier about the loss of personnel and, just the helter-skelter firing of federal workers. In most of the technology divisions in BIS, there are 3 or 4 subject matter experts at most in most of the technology sectors that are regulated by the Commerce Control List. And if those people are gone, there's a huge years and years of experience and knowledge and familiarity with the industry companies that they regulate, that they've worked with, that they've talked with, that they've met with. And so it's a relatively fragile and delicate mechanism at the end of the day within the BIS bureaucracy. And it doesn't take much to incapacitate the agency from doing what the government really needs done. So that would be my add-on there. Let's switch again one more time before we open it up to questions from the audience. We've focused mainly on Washington, D.C. up to this point. Can you give us a brief tour around the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific and talk to us about, besides China, what are some of the other national capitals that are critical? What's happening in Tokyo? What's happening in Seoul? What's happening in Pyongyang, for that matter, and Taipei, about export controls and how it affects their countries?
Maybe I'll start by mentioning something that I think we're all going to end up paying much more attention to in the coming year or two, which is actually data center build-outs in Southeast Asia, more so than Northeast Asia. I think if you just look at the trade statistics around where advanced AI chips are going worldwide, for reasons that are not entirely well understood at the moment, Singapore has gone up many hundreds of % in its imports of these advanced GPUs in just the last year or two. And a similar trend is occurring in Malaysia in particular. So I think that I guess the story is one probably of some sort of trade diversion that's happening, and we can see it in the statistics and trade statistics in real time. We don't fully understand the implications yet. I think that's just one area that is on my radar.
Guys, any others?
I don't have much to add beyond what John said. I do think that as within other sectors in other parts of the world, the bipolar struggle, and I'm not speaking sort of not in my Microsoft hat for a moment, but just the sort of bipolar struggle between the U.S. and China is playing out, and for us, it's relevant. Microsoft, it's relevant in the data center space, particularly in Singapore and Malaysia.
Oh, and again, just industry perspective or primarily, right? But, in various travels around Asia and sort of, discussion with sort of key firms across the board, I think fair bit of nervousness about, this whole piece of like having to choose a side, right? Particularly as you think kind of, outside of kind of the Washington, Beijing orbit, across the board, and what that quote unquote side ends up looking like may actually be very different depending on some of the technology areas that we're talking about too. And a lot of that, of course, is not, settled case law on sort of either side. So I think pretty fluid, pretty dynamic. And Nelson, coming back to your point around, this is going to be, likely a very important multilateral, discussion across the board.
So I'll add a footnote there that, many of us have been reading about the astronomical rise of share prices in NVIDIA, which makes graphic processing units, or GPUs, which are really the critical chip involved in training large language models and other uses in AI development. So one of the side features, going back to what John just said, is that a lot of the GPUs have been sold into third countries, not into China, into new data centers that then lease the capacity of those GPUs to customers offshore, not just locally in those third countries. And it's suspected that a lot of the development that's going on in China today of AI tools is being enabled by those third country providers who have legitimately bought GPUs that have managed to get away from a surveillance of U.S. export control authorities. But if the export control people knew from the beginning that they were going to use those chips to support Chinese developers, they might have had a different outcome from an export licensing standpoint. So that's just something to keep an eye on as the government struggles to deal with, these uses of these products when they go to third countries, and how we treat third countries then in terms of export licensing, and how much overview and insight we're going to ask our sellers like NVIDIA and others, what kind of due diligence is going to be required of them to know in the future where their chips are going, and how much do they need to know, and when do they need to know it. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop with my moderator questions and open it up for the audience here. Please raise your hand. I see one over here, this lady.
Thank you. My name is Nicola, and I'm from the Asia Group in DC. As many of you noted, export controls require a lot of coordination amongst allies and partners. The Trump administration may be moving away from such coordination. So my question is, what other Indo-Pacific nations do you see stepping up as the U.S. backs away, and what can we expect from those countries?
One little bit of nuance maybe to add to your question initially. A lot of the multilateral regimes are already quite gummed up, as it were. Between the Wassenaar Arrangement, the Australia Group, the MTC, Missile Technology Control Regime, these organizations, which are inherently multilateral, have really struggled for the last couple of years to update their control lists in line with a lot of the emerging technologies we see coming out. So with that bit of nuance, I think that that trend has incentivized both the previous administration and probably will incentivize this administration to pursue more plurilateral agreements between strategic partners on specific technologies. And in the Asia Pacific, as we've talked about, it depends on the technology vertical, which countries are going to be most consequential. But for many of the technologies BIS would consider critical or emerging, it's going to end up being, the Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore to some extent.
Any other responses to the question? I would add a footnote to John's response that we have been focusing in this panel today, particularly on export controls, kind of in a vacuum. But export controls are only one of many public policy tools used by the government. And we're engaged in what may be the beginning of a huge global trade war, where we're announcing and threatening 250% tariffs on other countries' goods, including the goods sourced by some of those allied nations that we want to cooperate with us on these export control issues. So the administration at some point is going to face a kind of a reckoning of trying to reconcile these different foreign policy goals, because it's very hard to be attacking and tearing up the economy of another nation the way that these tariffs are likely to do. And then the very next day, ask them, pretty please, will you change your export controls so that you will cut off billions of dollars of sales from your companies so they don't gain while our American companies lose. It just is a very cognitive dissonant situation.
Hey, Nelson, could I add one thing to that? I think one learning, ultimately, we're looking at outcomes based on what you can measure, right? And so part of these take time to shift. And so I think part of what is probably new here, to your point, is actually the velocity at which certain things are getting turned on and then also turned off. My guess is actually after the fact, it's actually going to be, other than sort of the political piece, which not even going to get into, it's actually going to be pretty hard, given that velocity piece, to sort of measure what has actually been sort of effective from a broad macro sense in some of these areas.
And I would also add, sort of on that velocity piece, it is probably too early to tell, but I think what keeps me up at night is the possibility that export controls start to be more transactional than they have in the past. I think in combination with the fact that the multilateral regimes are not functioning at the level that they have in the past, and that there is at least a perception that all trade mechanisms, to include tariffs, export controls, other trade levers, are kind of interconnected. If I were a capital in Asia, I would say, why would I, go out of my way to make my export control regime stronger, or collaborate with a partner to do that, and not try to get something out of it from the United States? I think that is not unprecedented, but I think it would be a new direction to kind of see, tariffs being turned on or turned off because a country, for example, is enhancing or not enhancing its export control regime. And that is, it's definitely foreseeable. It's not happening yet, but you could see it happening.
Next question. Back there, in the back.
Hi, I'm Mason Yu. I'm with the University of Washington Global Innovation Exchange, former diplomat with the U.S. State Department. I used to go on export control checks overseas, so this issue is near and dear to my heart. If you guys were to look around the bend, I'm curious what your thoughts might be for U.S. companies with a global footprint. What is the chief risk that you see of them facing, either through running afoul of export control enforcement, being disadvantaged by export controls, or having to navigate constraints on the critical supply chain? Thank you.
Great question. Why don't I jump in first, and then Katherine, I'm guessing you probably got some point of view on this as well. You kind of alluded to probably what the big one is, which is just, it's frankly like transaction compliance costs and frankly the uncertainty that's associated with that. I think this other piece on kind of like the velocity side, particularly the sort of the transactional side of increasing what some of these are looking like, is as many folks know, running afoul of these becomes very expensive and very punitive very quickly. And so you start to put a lot of infrastructure in place, and you actually end up being very risk off in terms of some of the moves that you think about. That could very well, one likely has a, chilling effect on, certain areas of sort of economic dynamism that we would, think in sort of, some of these key critical technology areas, but also too, if you're thinking in a global competitive perspective, what are the things that you can do versus, what may be, like take what you can do in if you're US based versus what you're doing if you're Europe based, for example. That's actually going to be a pretty different playing field in some way.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add to what Dale said, but I think the word supply chain kind of like lit up in red when you said that. I'm not a supply chain expert, so maybe this is part of my bias, but I think, export controls, they're coming quickly, but they tend to evolve in a pretty predictable fashion. Where we supply things from is very intricate, and there's the time horizon for those kinds of things is very long. And so for me, I'm particularly intimidated by the risks of having to adjust supply chains. And increasingly, some of what we would consider kind of like export control policies are directly implicating supply chain decisions. So for example, in the past, if there was an export control, you might wonder, is this going to, for a large company, if it doesn't impact me directly, will it impact my suppliers? Will it make it more difficult or more expensive to source from them? Now you have things like the AI diffusion rule, which is directly imposing requirements on a given U.S. company's supply chain. And that's, all very well and good. It's consistent with the goals of the underlying goals of the regime, the export control regime, that is. But it is, all of a sudden, the universe of policies that impact export controls or supply chain is just ballooning.
Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe to think about it more broadly than export controls specifically. When we were last in an environment similar to this around 2018, 2019 with the Section 301 tariffs going into effect, a lot of U.S. businesses that were operating in China realized that they were tacitly being incentivized to de-risk their supply chains away from their Chinese operations. And I think that's going to be true again in this instance. And in practice, what that ended up looking like is it was a great benefit for countries like Vietnam and Mexico because they chose to create a regulatory and building environment that made it very easy for firms that wanted to get out of China and into Vietnam or Mexico. Pretty easy. That to me seems sort of where we're headed in the next couple of years again. Maybe not to those countries specifically, but more of an emphasis given the export control stuff, the potential for new tariffs on de-risking away from Chinese-based operations. And it doesn't help that the Chinese government's making it less and less easy as an American company to do business in China.
One more point to add to what the other panelists have said is that although outside the purview of this particular panel, the U.S. government has very quietly been adding more import controls over the last decade, some insisted upon by Congress, others by executive order, and by actions of other agencies such as the Federal Communications Commission. So there are now almost 10 different lists maintained by different agencies of companies that are considered risky suppliers of one kind or another. This began at the time when we were first confronting Huawei and ZTE in China, but the list has grown for a variety of reasons. There are some that are connected with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act due to the repression of the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang province. There are others. The Defense Department has been charged by Congress to come up with this list of affiliated companies in China that support the People's Liberation Army. And so compliance personnel and multinational corporations have to worry about both ends of supply chains, not only where they source things from, but also where they sell. So the export controls affect the selling function. The import controls affect more and more the buying function of multinationals. Next question. Over here.
I'll just speak loud. Thank you so much. This is a fantastic panel. A lot of what underpins U.S. export controls in the semiconductor space is U.S. content and U.S. persons in the semiconductor supply chain. I wanted to understand, how big of a moat is that in your view? To what extent will we see? What would it take, I guess? What sort of scenario would we need to see unfold for companies like ASML and others to start designing out American content from their supply chains? Just curious for your thoughts on that.
I mean, at the risk of getting really in the weeds, the primary U.S. content in ASML's leading-edge lithography machines is a light source made by a company called Cymer in San Diego. So if you saw that company and its intellectual property move jurisdictions, that would be a signal of real change in that regard. More generally, though, I think that the moats are pretty big in EDA in particular. Cadence, Mentor, and Synopsys have 80 to 90% of the market worldwide for deposition and etch equipment, maybe without getting too in the weeds. Semiconductor manufacturing equipment more generally, the moats are pretty high. Obviously, there are lots of efforts worldwide to break down those moats, but there's a reason Applied Materials and Lam Research and some of these big firms are who they are, and it's because they have R&D budgets that allow them to win the race by running faster, and they've done so for many decades.
I want to echo a point that both John Dale and Katherine all mentioned, which is the STEM workforce, and something we really need to keep an eye on because the ability of companies like Cadence and Synopsys and others, Mentor Graphics and others of the predecessor generation, they're all because Silicon Valley has drawn the best and brightest electrical engineers for generations now. I used to work there. They were my clients. And it's only possible if we continue to have that open environment that attracts those best and brightest engineers. At the high point, we were nearly 300,000 students from Chinese universities studying in the United States. That number has begun to decline, and there's every signal from the current administration that they're happy to see it decline. And that really jeopardizes the future workforce that companies like Microsoft and others in the Valley and Boeing and everybody else have come to rely on year after year after year. When I was still practicing in the Valley, there was 1 year when the EE department, every single PhD at UC Berkeley's EE department was foreign born, 100%. So this is very vital to the future of American competitiveness and national security that we keep that pipeline open. If not, we're going to strangle ourselves. There was one more question over here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brendan Barry. I'm from the George Washington University. And my question was, the panel hit at it earlier, this trilateral, consensus framework between the U.S., the Netherlands, Japan on restricting and controlling the export of machining tools like the lithography machines for, semiconductor factories and fabs, right? And I'm thinking about the case of the Biden administration, putting export controls on South Korean fabs in China. So I was wondering how effective, does the panel feel controls like that were on, exporting, I guess, machinery? And in this case, it kind of affected a country that I think a lot of people are promoting as, U.S. and South Korea cooperation. And I also had a moment with someone who worked with the South Korean Trade Ministry, and I asked her perspective on this, and she noted that, when it came to the export restrictions, the consensus, she was like, well, the Dutch didn't put a restriction on human capital or human experts, just being able to fly out to those fabs in China and just tell them this is how you fix your machine if it doesn't work. So I was wondering if that's a loophole, or maybe the consensus just didn't care from that in the get-go.
Yeah, so a lot of nuance in your question. I'll try to unpack some of it. I think what you're referring to, I believe, is SK Hynix and Samsung's Chinese operations, especially their DRAM fabs and their inability to source extreme ultraviolet lithography tools from ASML. So, yeah, those facilities were built with the expectation that they would be EUV capable. And that's no small feat in and of itself, right? It's a lot of extra square footage in a clean room that's quite expensive. Of course, the ASML lithography tools have not been available for sale. The EUV tools specifically have not been available for sale in China for some time. I think that to your question on human capital and sort of the ability to service and repair existing tools, that's something that Nelson was alluding to kind of in his opening remarks, what we call deemed exports. There's been kind of a sea change in how the U.S. government has treated deemed exports in recent years, and the ability of the government to regulate knowledge in individuals and use it to support the maintenance of export-controlled machines. That is an area that's a little bit beyond my technical ability. When we talk about export controls being arcane, we're really getting there with that sort of question. But Nelson, you probably actually know better than me.
Well, I think another aspect in answer to that specific question was, and Catherine, correct me, but in the 2022 and then later in the 2023 amendments, there was for the first time, BIS regulated U.S. persons services, and that resulted in dozens and dozens of American personnel who had been forward-based in China or in third countries that were serving Chinese clients being pulled off those projects quite immediately. And, for those of us who are old enough, to have experienced a couple of generations of U.S. export controls, they never regulated services. That was a whole different regime. The OFAC sanctions regulated services, but BIS did not. And then all of a sudden, the rule pops up that suddenly U.S. personnel defined as U.S. citizens and permanent residents can no longer do these things. And that was a very sharp change in policy and practice.
Yeah, it does get very technical very quickly, very arcane. There's restrictions on what U.S. persons can do, restrictions, deemed exports being sort of the inverse of that, where you not actually exporting a thing, but allowing a foreign national subject to export controls to access the thing in the United States is considered an export, except under the semiconductor rules and also the recent AI rules sort of have carve-outs for that, which is, I think, helpful from a U.S. industry collaboration standpoint. But I think, to the extent that we're relying on partner nations to implement equivalent controls, if they are not similarly restricting their own personnel from transferring technical data, which could arguably be considered an export in and of itself, but if they're not restricting their, for example, Dutch personnel controls or activities, then that would be one kind of bone to pick on the part of the U.S. government with our collaborators, that they're not meeting the same bar. If that's, I don't know well enough to know if that's the case.
With that, we're going to bring this panel to an end. I would ask all of you to join me in thanking our panelists for today.